Thanks for having me here today. I want to go over some thinking that I've been doing, more like collecting together of other people's thinking, about how metrics are used, not only when you're thinking about things like DevOps or even site reliability engineering, but when you're thinking about how you're changing your organization over to get better at creating and deploying and running software, building, running, and managing, as we over here in VMware Tanzu would think about it. And to do that, I'm going to go over these three types of metrics and just go over what I see mature, high-performing organizations doing, what types of metrics they're collecting, and equally importantly, what they're doing with those metrics and why they are focusing on those metrics. First of all, this is me. Everyone calls me by my last name. You can feel free to do the same as well. So I'm pretty lucky in that I've had a job here at VMware Tanzu and Pivotal before that, really focusing a lot on helping large organizations understand how to do software better. I talk with them and research how they do it. I try to aggregate and pull together all of those studies and publish them. So far, I've been doing about one book a year, collecting together what they do. This book is actually out now. I should have updated my slide. This trilogy of books really goes over if you want to transform how you're doing software, your own software that you write in-house that you use to run your business, you use as your storefront or facing your citizens, your external facing software, how you rethink about that software, the technology stacks you put in place to make it run effectively, the processes that you do, the culture that you put in place, all that stuff we're always saying we're transforming in our digital transformation is what I spend a lot of my time focusing on. And you can get a copy of those books for free if you're interested, the little trilogy there, if you go to kote.io/books, if you're into that. I also do a couple of podcasts. I have a weekly software defined podcast that's just about tech news and stuff happening in the infrastructure area. And then I do a lot of video streaming and also a podcast here in VMware Tanzu land called Tanzu Talk. But, enough about me. I'm easy enough to track down if you enjoy my inane prattle about everything. So let's take a look at the meat of what we're going to be doing here, kind of an overview. Metrics, measurements, gauges, dashboards, numbers. I've been working in the tech industry here for a long time, since the late 90s. And specifically, I've worked also in the systems management or the monitoring or the infrastructure management. I've been a developer, and we always are interested in metrics. There's a predictable cycle of we come up with great metrics, and we almost ritually have to talk about how inane the previous regime of metrics that we used were. We love demeaning the previous state of the art in favor of the new. And I think with metrics, that's especially pernicious. We might make fun of past metrics like, why use gauges when you could synthesize what a metric means versus just like CPU percent time versus if a service is being affected. I think it's good to understand what categories of metrics there are, how they're being used, and come up with general principles of discovering what metrics are useful according to what goals you have. So I'm going to go over these three buckets. This is the way I bucket out metrics, right? Again, as I'll get into here shortly, thinking about what are we doing with IT? Why are we collecting these metrics? What's the service or the outcome or the point of this infrastructure, this IT, this software that we're providing? And therefore, how would we monitor and measure it? So there's some great technical metrics, and they change over time according to the technology used, the kind of acceptance of reliability versus uptime that you're looking at. But I'll look at some of the more popular ones, a good default starting point. And that's a good point with all these metrics. This is I'm not going to go over like, these are the only metrics you should monitor, or this is the exact metrics you should use. These are just things to start with to help you start figuring out which metrics are good for you. And these are some of the popular default ones. The other section is going to be going over what some business metrics are. And you might have heard people saying way back when, we need to focus on service management or service delivery. Nowadays, people like to talk about business value and business outcomes, but it's actually trying to gather metrics around the health of the point of what you're doing with IT, whether it's the software supporting it, the infrastructure supporting developers who are writing that software, whatever. But it's really good to think about what are those business metrics that are apart from the performance and the technology. And then finally, the part that I focus on the most in my conversations are what I would say are cultural metrics. Culture is like this catch-all phrase nowadays for like how we do things around here, the processes that we follow, the mindset that people have, all of that in the best meaning of this word, the bureaucracy that we in an organization have is largely the culture. Again, I always think of culture as how we do things around here, as I cover in another talk that I give every now and then. But especially when you're changing the culture, when you're transforming the way that you're operating, I think it's really important to try to to identify some metrics that you can track to see if you're doing a good job, if your idea of a new thing to follow works or not. I mean, if you're not really gathering metrics behind it, it's going to be difficult to know if it's working or not, other than your kind of gut feel about what it is. So first, I want to take a look at, to the point of that business metric, knowing why you're doing something. I want to give you a very simple example of what I think the point of a lot of transformation is, of digital transformation, if you will, and changing how you're doing things, getting better at software. And this is an older example, but a very crisp, straightforward example, especially for people in America. Everyone there, my fellow Americans, will be familiar with the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, the tax people. And this is an example that we at VMware Tanzu, we worked with the IRS some years ago, and they wanted to do a bit of digital transformation, get better at running a part of their business, or to put it in those terms, with software. So this is a key thing to ground yourself on, why we care about all of this, is whatever organization we're talking about, from the IRS to a retailer to a manufacturer, whatever it may be, what I'm interested in these organizations doing is, how do we run our business better with software? How do we make the customer experience better with software? How do we make the internal users experience better with software, so that we not only run our business more efficiently, but that we innovate and change and make the business better? That we can start to, like these tech companies we're always talking about, the way that we do our software is really the way that we innovate and run our business. They're not even aligned, they're intertwined with each other. The business is the software and the software is the business. So this is a good example of that will help us understand a lot of the thinking with the metrics. So several years ago, the IRS wanted to optimize one workflow, if you will, one way of going through things. And that's when you had delinquent taxes. You hadn't paid your taxes on time. If you wanted to know what that day's payout was for the taxes, you would have to use a call center to call someone up, and they would look it up for you and tell you. Now, every day you owe more taxes as a penalty, so people are very motivated so call centers are very expensive to run compared to computers. And also, to put it in operational metrics, the uptime and reliability of it was not very good. So only 37% of the calls actually got through to someone. Otherwise, you might be hung up on, you might be trapped in hold land forever, which is not cool for a service probably that you deliver. So what the IRS wanted to do is, they wanted to improve that experience for themselves, but also for their customers, for us citizens, and they wanted to put software in place. So originally, working in kind of a project mentality, they thought what we should do is we'll allow people to log in and see their complete account history, and they can find what the balances do, and that means how much they need to pay. They can hook it up and go pay it right away. That on the before screen, the software that they wrote. And because they had a very product-driven mentality, instead of just planning that out and releasing it after a year and seeing what happened, they instead learned and experimented and designed this the way that a tech company would. And they put an early version of this in front of users and learned from them. Does this work? Does our idea of how this software is going to work for you? And what they found is that people who went through this workflow, they found out that that a significant amount of them were still confused, and they didn't know how much money they owed. And by putting in place a very product-driven, a very design-driven way of doing software, like us tech companies do, they found that when you owe money to the IRS, you want to know how much money you owe to the IRS. And all you want to know when you log in is, how much money do I owe the IRS, so you can pay it. So they went through user interviews and research, and they came down to what on the right side there is that when you log in, you only want to know how much money you owe the IRS. I know I keep saying that, but these kind of insights become incredibly helpful when you finally get to these common sense things. So they started using that UI with users, and they found that many people didn't want to call the call center now. They could immediately find how much money they owed. And in fact, that became the solution that they used. And these are quite old numbers at the time. But over the next couple of years after releasing this, they had 2 million users using it. I'm sure it's up to much more than about $500 million in taxes. But it was a huge business success for them, because they got good at the process of doing software. Instead of delivering on that 12-month waterfall project way, they could deliver on a much smaller cycle and learn and study from what users were. Now, that's what organizations are shooting for, is how does our software evolve and make the way we're running our business, or in this case, a tax collection, better. And you can think about the counterfactual of that if they had just delivered on a 12 12-month basis, they wouldn't have achieved their business goals. Like they would have deployed that initial version after a year and people would still be calling into the call center. They wouldn't have achieved, as we'll get into, the business goals, the business metrics of having people call up the call center. They wouldn't have driven down the cost of the call center, and they wouldn't have improved the overall customer experience because people would still be going to the call center. So getting to that point where you have that kind of ability with software is what we're all shooting for in the type of digital transformation that I'm interested in, where you're getting better at your own software development. So in support of that, let's look at those 3 types of metrics that I recommend people starting with to do that. So to get to the point that we saw with the IRS, what you're going to end up doing, starting from the bottom, is you're more than likely going to be replacing your traditional infrastructure, your VM-driven infrastructure, with instead, when you look at the way containers are developed, they're a container. They're put to be running containers. And nowadays, what that means is running in a Kubernetes-based platform. That's the way that most organizations, after many years of sorting this out, have settled on for how you're going to be running things. So you might have something like the VMware Tanzu editions of Kubernetes. So what that means is that's a different type of infrastructure, a different type of application architecture and topology, and a different way of delivery, just a different set of expectations of what I would call the technical metrics, the performance metrics. Now, thankfully, over the past 10 years of DevOps and then site reliability engineering, there's been a lot of work to understand what types of metrics you use when it comes to monitoring that type of infrastructure and applications. What are the helpful metrics? This is a little bit of my background. I used to work at BMC on their kind of primary systems management and monitoring and log management tool. At the time, it was called Performance Manager. It was a rewrite that we did of Patrol Express. Anyways, if you've used my software, thank you. And I'm happy to apologize for any problems you had with software that I helped write there. But there's plenty of those gauge metrics, right? The infamous memory and CPU metrics. Those can be helpful when you're diagnosing things. But what we've learned from the DevOps area is instead, there are 4 metrics to start with that are not just raw performance metrics. And again, these are good ones to start with and see if they're helpful for you. So 1, thinking about that factory mentality that we have, right? The point of what we're doing is we're developing our own software, we're deploying it. We want to be able to, on a weekly, maybe every 2 weeks or so, deploy a new version, a new feature, so that like with the IRS, we have the opportunity to learn and improve, to innovate. What becomes very important there is to think about the rate at which you can deploy. How often can we release software? What's our deployment frequency? And you start monitoring this to, 1, improve, right? Because most organizations can't deploy a new release every week, let alone multiple times a week. But you want to start monitoring that to make sure that once you do achieve deploying every week or every 2 weeks, whatever cadence is good for you, that is a key metric to monitor. Are we getting better or worse at this? If you start to go down in your deployment frequency, or I shouldn't say go down, if you start to go up, if it takes you longer, then that's something you need to investigate. So it's a core operational metric to look at. Now, the other one is lead time for changes. Now, you can get all pedantic about lead time versus cycle time versus whatever. But what's important to monitor there is how long does it to go from an idea to getting a feature into production? How long does it take from thinking about something to getting that line of code in production? And this is apart from how frequently are you releasing anything. And again, this is another metric of how healthy your infrastructure, how healthy your development tools are, your release management is, even the way that you do security and governance. And you want to always think about how do we make it as quick as possible to get a new idea out. And then, of course, the other 2 ones to start with are the time to restore services. So rather than just monitoring uptime, how long have we been up? Or even availability, like what's our availability time? As you're deploying software more frequently, as you're giving yourself the ability, what you'll find is the errors happen in production. But what becomes important is whether it's mean, median, you're doing more complicated things, whatever your MTTR is, your time to restore, that's what you focus on mostly is how long does it take us to get back to a good state? And you always want to be monitoring that and making sure that it's at a good level that's acceptable for you. So the next is the change failure. And this is basically the other side of that, which is saying how many errors do we have, whether they're configuration errors, bugs for every release that we do? How many failures do we have each release? And this is another good one to start monitoring early on to bring that down. And also to be aware of, again, the overall health of the infrastructure that you have. Now, all of these metrics are more about your current state, the flow of what you're doing, the health of what you're doing. And they are different. And in addition to just the usual metrics that we see from my old days over there, right? So those are the kind of metrics, again, just to start with, that I see operations people and even your DevOps and developer people focusing on. Now, there's some additional interesting metrics if you look in the SRE or the site reliability engineering world to think about the latency, right? What is the application latency between your cloud or servers and the end users doing something, clicking on a button, and how soon does the page come back? The amount of traffic that you're experiencing, the errors that are occurring all the time, but not exactly change failure rate, but the errors that are acceptable, and then also saturation or usage that you have. And the SRE metrics are great for determining like the daily, maybe even hourly things that you monitor to make sure, again, you're not doing perfectly, because you're never going to achieve perfection in what you're delivering, but to know when you should start changing what your capacity is, when you need to stop deploying new features to focus on fixing the delivery that you're doing. All sorts of interesting things like that. I would highly recommend, if you haven't read up on the way that SRE thinks about metrics and gauges and monitoring, they've got a great mindset that goes along with that. But those are some DevOps-y technical metrics to start with that I see organizations using frequently. Now, let's look at another type of a part of that, thinking about another type of metric, another type of monitoring that happens very frequently with these new types of architectures. Again, most of the software that that we'll see going forward and that people are using in this kind of digitally transformed area, we've always been doing distributed applications. There's many monolithic applications out there, maybe done in a distributed application style where you've got various components of your application coordinating over a network instead of being one gigantic single process piece of code. Even when you've got a single process piece of code, you end up following distributed patterns, even if it's not distributed. But most all, to use one of my favorite phrases, of the applications out there are actually real distributed applications. They're bits of code spread out over a network that coordinate with each other over a network. Now, if you think about this, means that you are dealing with multiple servers that come and go, network connections, passing data back and forth. It's a lot of transient sort of things happening here. And so what becomes important in these types of cloud native applications is tracing, right? So when something's going wrong and you want to diagnose what happened in an error path for whatever, as you see in the sequence diagram here, let's say paying for my delinquent taxes. If something goes wrong, you want to be able to trace every single thing that happened over the network, over that distributed application to find out what went wrong. And this is tracing, right? So tracing, back from my day when I was working on this, has evolved a tremendous amount. And what this means in tracing is, as you see here, I forget what this microservice transaction is, but you can see how it spans many things. And you need some way when you're doing the diagnosing and monitoring this of knowing that it's one request going through. This traditionally has been extremely difficult to do. And you do a lot of network sniffing and a bunch of synthetic slapping on of a transaction. You're trying to decode and reconstruct, like some kind of Sherlock Holmes person, that transaction, that trace. But nowadays, thanks to a lot of the thinking that DevOps has done, developers actually are making it a lot easier for operations people to do this tracing. And in fact, if you use, for example, a lot of the stuff, if you use the Spring framework for your Java applications, and you use the really tight integration that we have in the VMware Tanzu stack, tracing, as they say, comes for free. It's just built into how a lot of that is done, because there's a very tight integration all the way from the Kubernetes layer to the container layer to the service management layer to the Spring framework layer to the custom code that applications are written to do this type of tracing. And so really pay attention to, when you're thinking about how we are doing our metrics and our monitoring of these new types of applications, what are the trace characteristics that we have, and look into how Spring does it and how it hooks into the Kubernetes layer and the other layers that we have in VMware Tanzu or whatever you're using land. Because this will be incredibly important, not only for diagnosing what's happening, but when you get even moderately sophisticated, you start to, in more or less real time, constantly be monitoring these traces, constantly be monitoring hundreds, thousands of these traces going on, and starting to do analytics based on that to find out when something is really happening, so that you can predict ahead of time, or not ahead of time, but you can get ahead of users reporting that their system is not working. And again, I would refer you to how SRE people think about looking at acceptable failure rates in the aggregate of these tracings here. But this is a key part of metrics and operational stuff when you're doing cloud native or container driven applications. So now let's look at business metrics that are out there and what people are doing. And I think this is key because, as you can see I think this is from a Forrester Commission study that we did. You can't click on it here, but you can look at the references down there. But you see this amongst developers and probably even operations people, is that self-reporting in many surveys, like the one this is from, only about a quarter of developers measure business metrics, measure their software in terms of business value, right? Instead, they're measuring delivery and a lot of those technical metrics. And this is, to use a technical term, not cool. Right? If you are developing software for someone, one of the primary things you need to be tracking is this software useful? Is it achieving the goals that the end users have, that the business has for this? I could write software and have it be excellent software delivered on time, on budget, and scheduled, that has great availability. And if it's not actually useful, it doesn't matter. So think back to that IRS example. They delivered that first version of what they thought was needed to see all of your account history, but people couldn't find their delinquent taxes, what they needed. So they instead would call the call center. So it didn't matter if that software was running. They needed to monitor the outcomes, the business metrics. So that's critical right from the beginning to monitor that. And here are some to start with. Now, these can be very situational, right? It depends what your business is. So in the case of the IRS, they were monitoring if people wanted to call the call center. But these are some common ones. And for the software, for the service that I'm delivering, what are important things to deliver? What are things that we can measure and report on? So obviously, sales or workflow completion, right? Closing a sale is a great business metric. It's easy. But if you're not closing a sale, it could be just finishing a workflow, like renewing a passport or filing some paperwork. How many times do people complete it? How often does it take? Now, it's obvious, but this is also important. Is anyone using the advanced features that we put into search, or do they just always use the common one that we have? Managing the cost of running it, the time that it takes to someone to complete something. I always think about cost in terms of time and money. That's another business outcome oriented thing. For the business, the cost per transaction, that helps you monitor your cost. So it's good to figure out how much does it cost for each transaction I'm doing? How is the new software features, the way of delivering this, bringing that down? And then finally, it's an obvious one and it's hard to monitor. Constantly be monitoring what's the experience that people have. You can also start to annoy them by asking about this too much, but just ask for a simple thumbs up or thumbs down thing. Did this go well for you? That's all I want to know. I often reflect that you see this a lot in bathrooms. There'll be that little thing where you do a happy face or a sad, and I see that everywhere nowadays, right? Like we worry, it seems like often we worry a lot more about monitoring people's satisfaction with using a bathroom or a toilet, as we say over here in Amsterdam, rather than the core enterprise software that they were using. So if you're worried about toilet sentiment, it's probably worth putting that into your applications as well and making sure that people are satisfied. And I want to focus on just one thing that I think people often miss out that is incredibly important nowadays, especially with transformation to monitor. And this is also, I would argue, a business metric, and that is measuring the amount of technical debt that you have. The way that your existing legacy technology systems and processes thinking is holding you back and slowing you down. Now, how you measure this, it might be about that cycle time that you have, how long it takes to go from idea to code. It might be about how many meetings you have to have with the ERP people to make one change. But start thinking about how can we monitor how much our existing legacy way of thinking is holding us back? How frequently maybe do we say we can't do that because of an old system? We can't do that because we're running on a batch job cycle on our mainframes every 24 or 48 hours. So therefore we can't do your real-time data usage or whatever it may be. Start to really take seriously, and I say this to the managers and the executives out there, because the staff people know that legacy is a problem. But this needs to be an incredibly important thing that you monitor. What is the technical debt that we have? How are legacy things slowing us down? Because very quick, that becomes almost, I would argue, the number one bottleneck. One of the top bottlenecks that people have is how much they're held back by that. And the other side of this is, so you need to really prioritize modernizing those legacy systems, modernizing and paying down the tech debt that you have, so that you can get to that point where you're more frequently on a twice weekly basis, so you're able to actually innovate on that business than just using some excuse that we use a mainframe or an ERP system and therefore we can't do anything meeting over. That's not really acceptable. So that's an area that you need to start monitoring and reacting to as well. So finally, I want to close out, speaking of transforming, on the culture metrics that you should focus on and start to monitor. Now, this is important for the people who are in charge of changing how the organization works. A lot of what I've been talking about are operational development metrics, but management and executives of these organizations, they need to think about their organization. That is their application, their service that they're providing, their legacy architecture that they need to transform and modernize. So in the same way that operations and development people are monitoring what they're doing, this group needs to monitor what they're doing and constantly be learning and adapting and changing what they're doing. If you're working in an organization and your managers and your executives are not changing their behavior, how they're doing their job, nothing is going to happen. It's key for them to actually change what they're doing. So that's a little tip for you. If you're low down in the stack, make sure that you can check out if things are actually happening, if your managers and executives are changing their behavior. So if you are one of those managers or executives, how do you monitor to see if the changes you're doing are good? This is a harder thing to monitor, and you're constantly going to have to learning and trying out new metrics. But here are a couple that I see people using that are helpful. So first, monitoring employee net promoter score, or ENPS. Basically, the core of it is that you ask people for employee NPS, would you recommend one of your friends working here? And that's a great way of measuring it, because it's not, are you happy? Do you think things are going well? It's saying, will you put your credibility on the line to get a friend to come work here? And that really will show belief and happiness in what's going on. Now, it's also good to see if your staff believes in the strategy. You can just ask them, do you think we're doing the right strategy? You can do that informally or in surveys, but the happier that your staff is, the more they believe in your strategy, chances are the changes, the culture that you're putting in are actually useful and working out. Now, the other thing to monitor are the amount of experiments and learnings that you're doing. So if you think about, we're transforming to evolving and innovating our business, therefore evolving and innovating our software and the tech stack, you should be running a huge amount of experiments and learning new things. Failing or learning at things, if you're not testing out a bunch of new things, then you're not evolving. You're just deploying features without learning from them. So put in place a way to think about how many times have we run an experiment? How many different things have we learned in going through processes that we have? And then you also want to monitor happiness of people through what is your retention and churn rate? How many people are leaving for other jobs? How long do actually people stay there? Now, you never want to have 100% staff retention, because there are a certain amount of people that, for two reasons. One, they may not be a good fit and they should leave. And that also means that you'll get new people in and new ideas. And there's a third distant thing. And there are some times where you want people to leave and go somewhere else, and some very small amount of those people come back to your organization and they bring in a new set of understandings, a new way of doing things that are useful. But really pay close attention to what your retention and churn rate are. And again, these are just starter metrics that you can use to start to monitor the culture. Again, if you're a management or executive, think about your organization as the system that you're wrapping metrics around and figuring things. So finally, I think it's important with all of these metrics to make sure to detect zombie metrics that you have, that you're not just, you don't want to put in place metrics that we use and we don't really even remember why we monitor them and why we use. So at the very beginning, at least, I would say on a quarterly basis, go through and evaluate all of the metrics that you're gathering and make sure that you actually care why you're gathering them. Are they useful? Is it worth our time? Or is this just adding in more nonsense that we need to pay attention to? And I think you would probably not be surprised that you'll be surprised at how many metrics you're gathering that no one can really tell you why you're gathering that metric or what you would be doing it for. And at the very least, you can keep gathering those metrics, but just stop paying attention to them until you need to. Constantly be thinking about, why are we gathering this metric? Is it valuable? Is it worth our time to think about it? And make sure that it's useful, especially at the beginning, because you will be trying out many new metrics, many new things that you're measuring, and constantly, not every second. But again, maybe on a weekly basis at the team level, maybe at a quarterly basis at the kind of group, make sure it's useful and eliminate the ones that are not useful so that you can try out new ones. Thanks for having me here. That's just a brief overview of, as I've been talking with large organizations, the kind of metrics that they're gathering and the mindset that they have, that kind of iterative learning mindset, and really connecting together. Why are we gathering that metric? Why is it useful for what we're doing? And hopefully it'll give you a chance to have a kind of a starter set on your own of things to do. I'm always easy to get a hold of if you're interested in talking more. And with that, enjoy the rest of the talks. They all look pretty good. Bye-bye.